Okay, let's dive in. So welcome those of you who are just joining us. You have found the right webinar. I'm Brad. I'm your senior consultant from TRG Arts and your diving instructor today for this deep dive into the Net Promoter System, building upon a conversation that TRG CEO Joe Robinson had with Net Promoter System creator, inventor extraordinary Fred Reichheld just a couple weeks ago. Some quick housekeeping, technical things. This is a webinar. I can't see you. I can't hear you, unfortunately. So if you've got questions or have comments, please use the Q&A button there in your Zoom window. I'm flying solo today, so I'll do my best to keep an eye on that screen as I'm walking through the content here as well. I've got time set aside at the end here for us to have lots of Q&A, I hope. So feel free to just let those pile up. If there's things I can pop to and answer really quickly, I will. Otherwise, I'll save them up and we'll go over them at the end. Okay, I think that's enough with the housekeeping. Let's get into the good stuff, shall we? Today, here's what we're going to tackle. This is what we're going to dive deeper into when it comes to Net Promoter System. We're going to talk about the maths for my UK friends, the questions that lead us through the Net Promoter System, a system framework. You heard Jill mention this at TRG 45, and I'm going to say this again and again. This is so much than a score. This is a system, and it's actually the system that drives change and impact and leads to fostering that love between your customers and you that Fred spoke so eloquently about. We'll get into some tactics. I've just highlighted some top 10 tactics that we have tested out in the field with arts and cultural practitioners using NPS over the past couple of years. And then some case studies, some bits of inspiration that I have found to be really useful bits of story and anecdata to help make the case around the impact of the Net Promoter System. Okay, let's dive in. First things first, Net Promoter System, Net Promoter Score, maths. All right, you'll recognize this slide if you watch the TRG 45 with Jill and Fred, but just a quick refresher on what the heck is the Net Promoter Score. So here's the rundown, right? Starts with that one magical question. How likely is it you would recommend us to a friend? A scale then offered from 0 to 10, with 9s and 10s being your promoters, 7s and 8s being your passives, and 0 to 6s being identified as detractors. And so therefore your Net Promoter Score is your promoters minus your detractors. But some of you may be wondering, hey, Brad, what about those passives? What about those 7s and 8s? Well, in the sort of original form Net Promoter Score, passives are just that. They're passives. They're neutral, right? The data doesn't show that they're either promoters or detractors, and so they're taken out of the equation altogether. There are some practitioners, however, that include passives as detractors and will calculate their NPS score as being basically your promoters minus everybody else proportionally. We recommend sticking to the promoters minus your detractors and just understanding that there's always going to be some in the middle there that are passive. Find including the passives as detractors as being a particularly hardcore way to calculate, and can be a rough way to calculate your Net Promoter Score. So what kinds of scores would we expect to see? This is some data that Fred helped us pull from StatMetrics. It just kind of looks at what are the scores that we tend to find across different sectors throughout the economy. You'll see there's a pretty wide range of, no surprise, internet service organizations down there at a -1. Basically, there are more detractors than there are promoters for most internet service providers. That you can count me among one of those. And then up at the top, we've got sort of computers, some banks, and some specialty stores and department stores. Basically, the point here, nobody's at 100, right? Ideally, you would like to be somewhere, in the positive territory and having, considerably more promoters than you do detractors, right? Thus net promoters, thus more or less moving in the right direction. But there's great variation across industries. So I know your next question is, well, Brad, what is normal for arts and cultural organizations? So we have been gathering and studying NPS data in arts and cultural organizations in the United States, Canada, and the UK. For a few years now, we've studied about 300,000 surveys across all three of those countries. Most of this data is all pre-pandemic, so I should just let you know that the flow of NPS data has really slowed to a trickle. Starting to ramp back up, but it really slowed to a trickle. So the vast majority of the data I'll share today is coming from pre-pandemic analysis, but right before the pandemic. We have a couple of different ways in which we've been asking and framing these questions. I'll get into more of that in a moment, but to scratch the itch about what is normal for arts and cultural organizations, when we think about net promoter surveys going out after individual performances, what we tend to see is the average NPS score is 65. Pretty good, right? If you recall from the previous slide, I think the top score was somewhere in the low 50s. But for arts and cultural organizations, post-performance across these three countries, we tend to see an average score of 65. If you think about this, it makes sense, right? We're in a business, in a joyful business, and a business that customers like to be a part of. They opt into. We are part of their free time. We are their hobby. We are their passion, right? So it would understand that folks are opting in to engage with us because they're already predisposed to like us, not because they have to engage with us like an internet service provider. We also tend to look at NPS scores by what we call engagements or relationships. And again, I'll get into more of that in a moment. What we see when we talk about asking folks how likely are they to recommend their, either their entire impression of an organization, when you reflect upon everything this organization, or when you reflect upon your entire relationship with an organization, or when we ask folks specifically about their loyalty activity, when we talk to subscribers or members and ask them to reflect upon, when you reflect upon being a member at such and such organization, would you recommend being a member, or would you recommend being a donor? Those scores we tend to see are much, much higher, right? There's some bias in there, obviously. Those are folks who are already pretty close to us, and there can be quite a bit of variation in the individual show performances. Okay, a couple of quick questions. I think these are good. I can hop to. I'd get a score in the 60s or the 80s if the scale is 1 to 10. Right. So good question. Remember, the math of the NPS score is of proportions. So what proportion of the respondents are promoters minus the proportion of detractors? So if you had 100 respondents and you had 20 of them as detractors and you had 80 of them as promoters, right? Your net promoter score would be 60, right? The 80 minus the 20. And how do you get the score if the scale is 1 to 10? Okay, yes, I think that's the answer, right? It's doing that math of the proportions. Now, circling back to this NPS score of 65 for what we tend to see post-performance, there's a kind of a disclaimer here. Your results may vary. What we have learned is that the proportion of subscribers or members in the audience relative to the proportion of single ticket buyers can really have a significant impact on the score. Jill alluded to this at TRG 45 not too long ago around subscribers tend to give lower scores than single ticket buyers. And there's even variation between new to file single ticket buyers and returning or existing single ticket buyers. But depending on what show and what proportion of that show is made up of subscribers versus single ticket buyers, you can see some pretty large variations in what your NPS score would be. But so this 65 kind of just balances all of that across the data set. So understanding that who is in your audience may also have an impact on your score. Okay, that's a quick primer on score and how the score part of it works. And I'm not going to talk much about score for the rest of our time together, because our position on this is, while the score is a tactic, it's a piece of this, the score is not the thing. It's the system that you put around the score that helps you really get to unlock the impact that NPS can have. So we are not going to focus so much on score. We're going to focus more on system and the pieces that go into the system. And one of the most important elements here is, of course, the question or questions as it has evolved over the years. What started as one question, period, or question mark from Fred and his team, has evolved to include variations on that, and I'll talk about that. But really, the point here is as limited and as few questions as possible should be going into your NPS work. All right, here's how I'm going to explain some of this jargon. I alluded to this earlier with experiences and engagements and relationships and what's what and what are we talking about here. So here's a jargon alert and a quick little bit of science lesson for you all to help explain how we frame what it is that we are asking about, just so that we can all be on the same page. And we've modeled this from the language that Bain and Fred uses in his books in talking about NPS, so that when you read up, you'll understand what the correlation between some of the jargon they use and some of the perhaps the experiences and engagements we have in our sector. Okay, so atoms, right? They're everywhere, teeny tiny, small, but they're the building blocks of everything else. Atoms make molecules, right? We can group some atoms together and all of a sudden we've got molecules. We group a bunch of molecules together and we have matter, right? That's the building blocks, and that's the extent of my science knowledge. So no more questions about science for this guy. How does this relate to what we're talking about here? So when we talk about touch points are like the atoms that we have with our customers. We can have lots and lots and lots of touch points, everything from a website visit to using our cafe bar, to picking up their tickets, to having their tickets arrive in the mail, to a phone interaction, to using the parking lot, to finding their way to your building, right? Loads and loads of touch points make up a set of experiences that they have. Attending a show can be an experience that a customer has made up of lots of touch points. And the important thing for us here is when we talk about experiences, this is where we might think of attending a performance as the most common, simplest form of an experience in this way. This is an important place where we can, let's test. Let's ask the question. This is a time to NPS. What we find is that at this experience stage, you can already be creating promoters, you can be creating detractors at this stage. They can have positive or negative feelings from a touch point along the way that could inform how they feel about an entire experience. So when we think about experiences, this is an area where we can opt to intervene and start asking some of those questions about NPS, so that we can make sure we can get to some of the root causes of either what is driving them to be promoters or what is pushing them to be detractors. But then over time, we have customers and audiences and patrons, whatever term you want to use. They have lots of experiences with us, lots of different kinds of experiences with us, which leads to their engagement with us, engagement with the organization as a whole, as a subscriber donor, as a member, as someone who's, maybe come to a few shows here and there, or I come to some shows and I have my kid in some drama classes, right? All of those things represent the engagement that customer has with the organization. And this is also a really valuable place for us to understand how folks are feeling about our organization as a whole, about their relationship with us. So that's why I think back to that data I had before about 65 as a score for experiences and 85 as a score for engagement, right? There are instances where we have folks who may not love every show that we do, but still think very highly of the organization and the relationship with the organization. And when we ask those questions differently, we can get really different scores. So how do you focus your question? The important thing is we want to shape our question, our NPS question, based upon, well, what are we asking about? What are we trying to understand? And what are we looking for as the touch points or the experiences that are driving promotion or detraction within our patron base? So experiences, these can be things like, of course, seeing a show, but also thinking about the purchase path, the reservation experience, an experience someone has with a technology platform, the whole arrival, departure, check-in experience, anything that's happening within the food cafe bar, right? Not just a particular transaction, but you could be asking about any of those in addition to just asking about what did you think of this particular performance? And as I mentioned, the engagement, we're thinking about when you reflect upon your entire experience with such and such organization, how likely are you to recommend this organization to a friend or family member? Same thing, right? When you reflect on being a donor or subscriber, we can ask those questions more holistically, knowing that all of those are made up of individual experiences. Another key thing from our point of view to remember here is you don't have to give feedback from every single person about every experience. It's a lot to manage. You can over-survey people, and you may have people who are overlapping and crossing over between experiences and engagements and relationships. And so it's just important to remember to sample and to segment. We'll talk a lot about that as well today. and really focus on the areas where you have the most opportunity or have the most risk to create promoters or to create detractors. That will help you focus your question, prioritize your question on just the places where you think you can have the most feedback, where you think you could have, where you could make the most difference within your organization. Building blocks for the right question. So there, depending on what you're asking, who you're asking, what the context is for what you're asking, there's some components here to piecing together the right question to lead your NPS survey. This first bit here, right? This is the focus. This is the scope. This is helping to guide the recipient of the survey to put them in the right frame of mind. When you reflect upon your recent attendance to Guys and Dolls, when you reflect upon your year as a member, right? We put this into context to let them know what is it in terms of whether it's an experience, whether it's the engagement, right? How we put the recipient of the survey into focus and we understand the scope of what we're asking about. Sidebar here, segment. This is where we segment. This is where it's really important to understand the difference between what potentially a single ticket buyer may say to your question versus a subscriber member versus a donor versus a first-time attendee, right? There could be lots of ways. You could be wanting to segment based on geography. You could be want to segment based on other buyer types that you may have. But the important thing here is you want to segment all of this from the very beginning. So once you've got your focus, once you've got your scope, then it will lead you into the actual question. What we tend to see and what we've tested and recommend is that there's kind of, two basic, structures to the actual question here. How likely are you to recommend? Tried and true, NPS OG approach right there. We've also found that how satisfied are you can be also a helpful phrase for some interactions where, if you're asking someone, how likely are you to be a subscriber to this theater company, to a friend or family member? And it just opens up a lot of questions with other folks. I don't know, do they like theater? Do they come here? Would they want to be a subscriber, right? And so maybe we've found a more pertinent question is this satisfaction question, which is a slight variation on the recommend question. So you can play with that language a little bit. Just think through, what is it that I'm trying to understand? Who am I asking? And therefore, what is the framing of the question that's going to get me where I want to go? On all of this, scale of 0 to 10, you can go back and you can read Fred's books as to why it's a scale of 0 to 10. They did lots of research and testing and figured out this is the best. So scale of 0 to 10, that's the consistent on all of these. Then there's the open-ended or verbatim question that follows, right? You can have two approaches here. One, letting everyone just say open-ended, not leading the witness too much to say, just, okay, tell us about your score, right? Very, very generic, right? Allows the recipient of the survey to really highlight what's most important to them. If you try to lead them too much, well, tell us about your score. What did you think about the health and safety restrictions or policies and protocols in place, right? That can, while that sounds helpful, it also really limits the scope and point of view of what the patron may be thinking about and potentially misses an opportunity for them to elevate what's important to them as opposed to us dictating what's most important for us. The second question here, Fred has added in recent years and based off of the recommendation of his daughter, Jenny. So this second question here is called the Jenny question. How could we make your experience even better? What his daughter found working at a beverage retailer was that they were getting lots of really high scores, lots of promoters. And in that feedback, when they say, tell us about your score, they just say, you're great. I love you. Love the show. You guys are awesome, right? While that's nice to hear, it's not very actionable feedback. And so they started rolling out this question. It says, okay, thank you. We're glad you're having a wonderful time. Thank you for being, an excellent customer, a loyal customer, but how could we make your experience even better? And by introducing this question, it prompts a different kind of feedback. And it actually gave, in this case, Jenny's business an opportunity to realize, oh, there were additional products that they could be providing. There were additional services that their most loyal customers were interested in, right? So just that slight variation of the question, only to passives and promoters, allows us to have perhaps more actionable feedback from folks who are giving us the highest scores. Folks who are giving us the lowest scores, they tend to not need this question. They tend to only be served the first question, which is tell us about your score, right? They tend to highlight the main reasons why they have given the score that they have. Lastly, here is a question, kind of an optional question, depending on how you're handling whether you're positioning this survey as anonymous or not. We've tested this both ways. What we have found is, yes, anonymous surveys get higher response rates, but the cost of that is that it becomes really difficult to close loops. And that is a key part of the system, of the Net Promoter System. It's not just collecting the scores. It's not just collecting the feedback. It's your ability to close loops directly with customers. And in anonymous surveys, it is really, really difficult to do. And so this is why, some folks have initially set it up as an anonymous survey, given folks the opportunity to opt in and say, may we follow up with you about your score, yes or no, and then just give us an email address or something. So that additional element allows folks maybe a middle ground between making it an anonymous survey entirely but not being able to close any loops with customers. Okay, that's a deep dive on questions. Now, framework, getting to the real heart of the matter. How do we go from a score to a system? What we've developed and tested and built with this cohort of 6 theaters from the United States, Canada, and UK that Jill mentioned on the call the other day is a framework that is cyclical and is really quite detailed, and is what is intended to impact the culture of your organization. This is something. NPS is not the thing that lives in the marketing department or in your sales department or in your box office department. That is a nice score to hang up on the wall and to feel good about. This is about developing a culture that loves its customers and vice versa. Its customers love the organization, which really requires deep listening to your customers in a way that is thoughtful and responsive and intentional. And to do that requires a fair amount of infrastructure to get that done. And so these are the elements of the framework that we've identified in order to move from score to system within an organization. First piece is what we're calling campaigns, right? Listening campaigns, survey campaigns. So in each of these, needing to understand and be able to articulate who are we asking? Why are we asking them? When are we going to ask them? Who's responsible for asking them? Like, which department? Is this a marketing? Is this membership? Is this artistic? Is this development? Does this sit somewhere in between? What tools are we going to use? Is it going to be an email survey? Is it going to be a text-based survey? Are we going to, when are we going to send it out? Where does the data live? All of that. And what are the questions that we're going to pose depending on the segment and depending on whether we are looking at experiences or engagements. Once you have this information figured out, the campaign information helps you move into reporting, right? What are we going to measure? Where is this information going to be? Who is going to lead the gathering and the analysis of the data that comes in from the NPS? And then really important here in the reporting is not just being able to do the math to understand what the score is, or to have some way to categorize the verbatim feedback or review the verbatim feedback that's coming in from respondents. It's how are we going to share this data with whom and when across the organization? The only way this can impact culture is if this work, it touches across departments, across the entire organization. And largely that takes place in the process of preparing reports and sharing data and sharing it at the right time for the right department within the organization. So you'll want to map all of that out. The other major element here, and probably the most important, if you don't take anything else away from this session today, it would be 2 things. 1, segment your NPS surveys, and 2, build your system for closing loops. Understand what your organization can do to close loops. It's rude to ask for feedback and to not say thank you, or then to not follow up on feedback, right? This is something we've probably all learned in our personal lives or in our professional lives. And so it's just that way with customers. To love our customers, we need to listen to them and then feedback to them and respond to them, let them know that we've heard them. This doesn't mean that we acquiesce necessarily. This doesn't mean that we give customers everything that they want, or that they get to dictate what our next season is going to be. But what it means is we have asked for feedback, they have given it to us. And so therefore we need to reciprocate that kindness in order to cement the relationship that we have with customers. And so closing loops becomes really important. We need to understand what are the conditions for responding, what types of feedback or what types of scores within your organization warrant a direct response or what gets an automated response, who's going to respond and how, what types of responses get elevated up to higher levels within the organizations, and what can be handled at frontline staff level to respond to questions. And then how are we tracking how well we're doing at closing loops and sharing responses back across the organization, both to have that standing ovation moment that Fred spoke about, but also so that we know how well we're doing at connecting and really feeding back that, really feeding into that feedback loop that our customers are creating. Okay, yeah. How do you do all this? Take a survey, follow up, in a small org with a staff of 3 or 4. What are the biggest things to hit, and what can wait? I'll get to that one. That's true. It's a big question. Yeah, we'll talk about that because it's possible. It's possible. Last part here is the investment and the ROI, right? So Fred talked about, and this is a relatively new metric to us in his new book, right? But the earned growth rate, which makes a lot of sense. As a reminder, that's your repeats, your renewals, your upgrades, plus your referrals, your new earned customers that come in. But you also want to be looking at, what is it costing you to acquire customers? What is it costing you to retain? What is all of this system costing you in terms of staff time and financial resources? And how do you start to put some numeric value, some financial value to the benefits of this, right? Is it cost savings in other places? Are you finding that you need to spend less on marketing because you've got a more loyal audience base and you're not having to spend as much to buy customers, as Fred was talking about? Is it just helping you be closer to your mission? I have this is probably the least fleshed out and least tested element of the system, to be perfectly fair and honest. It's the most difficult for most organizations to tackle. We've got thoughts on it, but I've pulled an example later on from an organization outside of our sector who's done it well, that I think is replicable, but this is the one that's probably the hardest for us to capture in our organizations. All of these things, following this loop, touching the various parts of the organization, doing the feedback and the follow-up, making sure that this is driving that earned growth rate within your business. When you implement all of this, it's building the culture. It is building a culture of listening, a culture of passion for your customers across the organization, not just in the marketing department, but it ends up spreading throughout development, through the artistic side, through your frontline staff and operations when you're implementing this thoroughly. All right, some tactics. David Letterman fan, top 10 list. I just pulled 10 things. So here's my own kind of top 10 list of tactics that we have seen and tested and worked from in the sector. Fred's book, Winning on Purpose, I think is what it's called. That's the latest book. It builds upon a lot of his previous books. So if you haven't read his other ones, I think you could start there. It would probably give you a pretty good gist of everything that had come before. Okay, top 10 tactics for what has been working in the sector. And to your question just before, what are the 3 things that I think, if you do nothing else, to just kind of start this at the most simplest level, at the smallest organization, I fully believe this work can be scalable, and you just need to bite off what your organization can chew. And the first part of that is just to segment and target. We're not going to ask everybody everything after every single show, but to really have focused conversations internally to say, what right now, for where we are as an organization, what is the feedback that is most important to us? What is the segment or the relationship that we're most concerned about making sure that we improve or that we build upon? Using that to get really focused on where to start implementing this work will help make it manageable for your organization. Closing loops is going to be important. So knowing that will help you anticipate where to segment and target. I was working with one organization, small team, in the cohort, had a very similar question, and they just decided, we've got too many. We can't ask our single ticket buyers. It's far too many for us to manage and to do all of this well. Maybe our subscriber base we could handle. And so they started with a smaller chunk of their audience to say, we'll start this with our subscribers. Folks we already know, we kind of already have some relationship with, and then as they build capacity, they would look for the right opportunities or the right shows to maybe dip their toe into expanding to include single ticket buyers. So start from where you can, but make sure it's really tied to where you want to make the most impact. But I would go into that knowing, saying, who is it that if we had to follow up with folks, even if just to say thank you, we got you, we hear you, we appreciate it, right? It doesn't have to be a full-on hour-long conversation on the phone following up with a patron every time, but understanding that what could we manage, and using that to help inform your targeting and your segmentation. And then the third thing is just find a way to distill this information and to share it across your organization. Some folks are finding ways to keep it within their CRM, which is great, right? When a patron calls up, or they're walking up and you've got frontline staff pulling up the records and you're able to see what their NPS scores have been, any verbatim feedback that they've given, it gives them an opportunity to show, oh, I heard that you had a hard time at the parking garage and Brad took care of that for you. Is that right? Have you been back? Everything good since, right? Being able to close that loop, reinforce that experience across the organization, having that information at your fingertips, if you can be really, really powerful. Other things, the top three, I would say those are probably, again, if there's nothing else you take away, those top three. But for black belts in NPS and wanting to go deeper into this, test surveys that are entirely anonymous or that opt in with the contact information. Try to understand what's the quality of feedback that you get, what's your response rate like. Tracking response rates, right? Learn to test and improve. What we've seen in our cohorts and the folks that we have worked with over time is that on an email survey, there would be a pretty good response rate would be 18 to 20% on an email survey. If you can get better than that, great, right? Gold standard. But if you're below that, we may need to look at test and learn and try to test some different strategies there to get folks to reply. And again, a reminder is going to be really, really important. I think that's my next one. Email surveys, you want those as close to the experience or the engagement as possible, right? So ideally, what happens is if you're just asking after a show, would you recommend Guys and Dolls to a friend? Ideally, the survey is waiting for the audience member in their email as they're walking out of the theater and they're heading towards their car or train or bus or scooter. So whatever it is, that ideally is close to when they're having that experience as possible. Sometimes folks, because of bandwidth or because of how challenging it gets to distribute these, right? Sometimes it's a day or two after, or maybe it's a week or two, but the further away that you get, we learned, the lower the response rate and the lesser quality the feedback is. And it's perfectly okay to send a reminder. We'd also test alternative to email surveys. That's still the predominant tool that most folks are using. It's the most straightforward and efficient. It gets a pretty decent response rate, but as we all know, email is not going to be great for everybody. It's not going to capture all the segments that we may most want to hear from. And so really test and learn different alternatives. We had organizations in the cohort try things in text message. We had them try things sort of, anonymous feedback iPads in the lobby after shows that they had people kind of just encouraging folks as they walked out to give feedback to. They had folks with paper surveys going around and asking for feedback and kind of distributing the survey manually. So there's lots of ways that you could try. It's just a matter of what's going to work best for you, depending on who you're looking to serve. But email tends to be the de facto. Categorize your verbatim feedback. I've seen a number of strategies with this here. There are some web-based text analysis tools that you can just upload raw text into to make word clouds or to start to do some really basic kind of, smart AI kind of learning around being able to pull themes out of text. There's some of those things organizations have been using to save themselves the time and the energy of having to read all of that verbatim feedback. But I know a number of organizations have just been able to, have a person review the verbatim feedback and put it into some kind of categories that are determined ahead of time as to helping us identify what's the kind of core bit of feedback. Is it about the show? Is it about the parking? Is it about the bathrooms? Is this a really unhappy customer that needs to be elevated up, that needs immediate feedback or attention? Finding ways to simplify and quickly categorize the verbatim feedback is really helpful. And we've also seen it be quite effective to build a kind of internal NPS team. If you've got the resources, again, if your team is large enough, making sure that team who helps implement and share information and develop reports and develop strategy around NPS, make sure that it extends beyond the marketing department. It's just the problem is The challenge is that this can be siloed and as just a sales or marketing tactic and not something that is about how the entire organization relates to its customers, regardless of what department. And so it's important to think about this as an opportunity to bust some silos and to have a leader. Examples of web-based analysis tools. That is a good question for follow-up. I'm blanking on the one that we have seen. There's like this, it's kind of like a bit of a machine learning service that can just kind of take in survey data and start to identify clusters of words and their likelihood to be repeated. So let me follow up on that question. Feel free to drop me a note in the chat if you'd like, and I can get back to you on email about those. Last, track, report, share, referral data. So referral data is also, we're incorporating this from Fred's most recent recommendations and coming out of his most recent book, which is being able to go just one step further about referrals and not just kind of categorizing word of mouth. Fortunately, as Jill mentioned, many organizations are already quite good at being able to ask the question, how did you hear about us? Or what brought you in today, right? Those kinds of questions. And word of mouth is often an option, but maybe expanding upon that option just a little bit with a little more detail about a referral. And I'm reading your question right now. We present public art. We do not have an email segment exclusively of attendees to our major activities. How important is it to only send these surveys to people who attended? Well, I think it's going to depend on what you're trying to know, right? What are we trying to ask, and who are we trying to serve? I could imagine that in a public art setting, there might be an opportunity to include a QR code or some way around or near a piece or an exhibition that would just maybe tacitly, softly invite people to let us know what they think anonymously, right, on their phones or nearby, that just says, let us know what you thought, or if there's any feedback. But I do think it's important for you to make sure we're understanding why would we ask this question, and therefore or who, and if on folks discovering public art, maybe there's an informal way on the site or at the location that we could ask people to share their feedback with us. Great, thank you, April. Yeah, I don't know how folks are doing it in Patman. I know in some other systems, folks are tracking and adding notes as kind of customer notes or chatter notes within patron records, particularly if there's loops that need to be closed. All right, just some case studies here as we wind down our time together. These are just examples of what we've seen so far in the field of folks creating some impact after using NPS. These are just the stories that inspired me. There are some artistic examples, right? Subtle shifts to sound levels in a performance. There's one theater, they just kept hearing in their NPS feedback that parts of the show were just so loud. It was uncomfortably loud. That hadn't occurred to them before. They were able to go back to the company and adjust the sound levels, right, in the show, and the feedback went away through the rest of the run, right? So small things, right? Artistic director closing loops with an upset patron evolved into a more personal, meaningful relationship. This was a rather funny story around, I think it was the musical Elf, very upset patron about there being what they thought was an inappropriate sex scene in the show, which doesn't really exist. They had just misunderstood what was kind of going on in the background. It led to a long conversation that the artistic director decided they wanted to handle this feedback with this patron personally, started a long conversation, resolved it, and actually became regular friends, sharing recipes back and forth afterwards, right, with a customer that started with a negative interaction. Like, to me, that's a great example of how this, how we build relationships with our customers through these. Now, we can't do that on scale, but if you think about this as becoming the culture of your organization, the nature of building promoters, and how that customer will then have a story to tell about how they were able to connect with the artistic director over this misunderstanding with what happened on stage, is exactly that point of how do we build referrals and loving our customers. Front of house, some great examples around in the lobby of one theater, their number one selling snack had really loud packaging and was showing up in their feedback, and folks were taking it back into the theater. The theater was able to use that feedback. And so they went back to the manufacturer and said, hey, we love these, it's our top selling, but we're getting this negative feedback, and they're able to work with the manufacturer to get some different packaging to be less loud, right? So a win-win in terms of being able to resolve issues with their customers. A couple of organizations developing roles that sit between front of house and box office to help administer NPS, and the power of portfolioed approaches for box office teams, right, to be able to provide that direct response, making it really clear. Silo busting, we've heard examples of directors updating notes in a program or how they're talking about a show based on feedback coming from NPS surveys and audiences. Not that they're changing the show or doing anything different artistically, but it is maybe helping artistic leaders understand where they might need to improve their communication around a particular show in order to better connect with audiences. So that's an example of, again, taking in that feedback and demonstrating it back to our audiences. Also great examples of development teams being able to work with marketing to identify really strong positive NPS feedback from folks who are not yet donors, but strong potential donors for donor acquisition. And my one non-arts example, as I mentioned earlier, is because the economic impact part, fully admit, has been really, really difficult to measure so far in the past couple of years. But and I took this right out of Fred's book before the most recent one. But there's an electronics company just decided, for us to measure economic impact, we're going to study. They just did a sample of accounts, and they said, look, for these accounts, these records, we're going to study their business over the next couple of years. And we're going to look at how their revenues changed relative to their NPS scores have changed over time. What they found is where, of those records where the NPS improved in that window, revenues from those accounts increased nearly 70%. Where the NPS was flat, revenues grew about 6%. But where NPS declined, revenues dropped 24%, right? So I think this would take time. It's longitudinal. You'd need to kind of put some structure to it, but it demonstrates the way, the very maybe simple ways you can decide to measure the economic return on your NPS feedback over time by just sampling your database and by sampling those who are already engaging with you. Okay. Questions. This is your chance to get them in the deck. Yes, they'll go out with the link to folks watching back on the. It will be on the TRG website. That's that one. Other questions you may have. So great to see folks connecting in the chat on how to share some of the strategies. I will do some thinking, Lydia, on and reflecting on what are the examples that I have seen for other kind of non-word cloud based text tools. All right, as we are, I'm not seeing any other questions pop up. So here we go. One last little slide here. Thanks for diving in with me. It's been a whirlwind. Thank you. So fast. Lots of information I've thrown at you. This will be recorded if you need to watch back. Yes, please share your feedback. Guess what? There'll be an NPS survey pop up as soon as the webinar ends. So we do encourage you to share your feedback with us. We use NPS internally. We use it with our clients. It's become a big part of our business. So we're practicing what we preach. You've seen this hopefully before, a way to schedule a 30-minute call there with us on that link, trgarts.com/schedule a call. My email down there on the bottom left, if you'd like to connect with me directly, that's how you can reach me. Anyway, thank you for jumping in here, everyone, and going on this NPS journey with us. I wish you all happy Thursdays or whatever. It's not Thursday, it's Wednesday. Anyway, have a great week, everybody. Thank you.